Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to remind you that the taking of photographs and use of recording equipment are strictly prohibited in the concert hall. Please take this moment now to silence your cell phones. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome. On behalf of 92nd Street Y, I want to thank our co-producer, Folks, Forum of Law, Culture, and Society, and specifically their director, Thame Rosenbaum, and our moderator, who is also our moderator, for making tonight's very special conversation possible, which I'm told has been over 2 years in the making. As a community center, your participation is important to us. Please write your questions on the cards you've been handed. Our ushers will come down the aisle to collect them midway through our program. In addition to being the director of Folks, Thane Rosenbaum is an essayist and author of many books of fiction and nonfiction, reviews and essays, and he writes a lot about our subject tonight, Israel. He is also co-presents here at the Y the Folks film series, and we hope to see you at the screening of the film The Siege on April 11th, followed by a conversation with its director, Ed Zwick, CNN analyst Juliette Kayyem, and terrorist expert David Sharaya. And they will be discussing the relevancy of the film to today's political climate. I invite you to visit our website, 92y.org, for information on all our 92y talks. And now, without further ado, I turn the program over to Thame Rosenbaum.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Welcome, everyone, to the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society here at the 92nd Street Y. We are joined today with my friend, Ambassador Ron Dermer, who is Israel's ambassador to the United States. He is a youthful-looking ambassador, and that's because he always was a sort of a wunderkind of sorts. He graduated from Penn. He then went off to get a degree at Oxford, a graduate degree in politics, philosophy, and economics. Soon after that, he was in Israel, and he was almost immediately an advisor to Natan Sharansky. During that time, he did a number of things with Sharansky, included co-authoring the book, The Case for Democracy. You remember that? That was George W. Bush's favorite book of all time. He used to tell everybody about that, and the ambassador was the co-author.
We were at an event yesterday with the former president, and unfortunately, he asked for the royalties.
Because he knows.
The event, yeah.
Yeah, no,
he did mention that, so I've been trying to avoid him now.
I remember he told everybody this was his favorite book. The ambassador then wound up working in Ariel Sharon's administration as the, let's see, what were you? You were an economic attaché in Washington for a few years. And then after that, returned for Benjamin Netanyahu's administration to become his senior advisor for a number of years. I don't know if this is the kind of thing that you want to repeat, but he was for many years called Bibi's brain. I don't know if that...
He's got a big brain.
Yeah, I would say, he seems like a smart guy anyway.
Yeah.
But this is how close they were. And then in 2013, Ambassador Dermer became Israel's ambassador to the United States. And I think at some point you're getting almost to one of the longest serving ambassadors at this point.
Well, the first one was very short, Eliyahu Eilat. But the second one, the most famous, Abba Ebed,
right, of course,
was 9 years
right.
as ambassador. And then Ambassador Harman was also 9 years.
I see.
But since then, it's, I think, Simcha Dinitz. I don't know if people remember Simcha Dinitz in the 70s. He was about 6 years.
6 years. Before we get to tonight's conversation, there's something that you might not realize about us if you're just looking at us casually, but we're both from Miami Beach, Florida. I am considerably older, but when I was a little boy in Miami Beach, Ambassador's father, Jay Dermer, was the mayor of Miami Beach. Two-term mayor when I was a little boy. And so, I mean, this to me it's a homecoming of sorts. Now, I should say, he's probably not...
Did you pay all your parking tickets?
Well, I was only 9 at the time. I would never do that on a Dermer's watch. He may not want to have people to know this, but I'm comfortable saying this, that when we were living in Miami Beach at these different eras, nobody there thought anything good would come of us. I mean, nothing. I mean, I think they thought he would be like a lifeguard, I would be like a parking attendant, something like that. And he ended up Israel's ambassador to the United States, and I don't exactly know what I do, but I achieved a lot more than they thought.
We did make one important intellectual contribution to the world Miami Beach.
Which is?
One of Churchill's most famous speeches is the Iron Curtain speech, and he gave that in Fulton, Missouri. But he wrote it on vacation in Miami Beach. And we're very proud of that.
We like to say
we're very proud of that. We have had an impact on the world.
On the beach, he wrote it. Well, when my parents moved to Miami Beach, they thought they were making Aliyah. But he actually made the real Aliyah.
It's not a joke. The Lubavitcher Rebbe called Miami Beach the Jerusalem of the diaspora.
Yeah. No, there's... People forget. I remember we had a number of years ago Matthew Weiner for the show Mad Men on here on the stage. It was Matthew. And there's an episode from the first season about the Jewish Office of Tourism in 1960 trying to hire a Goyish advertising firm to help promote tourism in 1960, which is actually probably what happened. And they had these pictures of female IDF soldiers, and they're trying to figure out how to make Israel an attractive place to go in the 1960s because it wasn't an obvious destination for either Aliyah or for vacationing. So you've just come back from AIPAC. 18,000 people were there. Rousing ovations for Prime Minister Netanyahu, rousing ovations for Ambassador Haley, from America's ambassador to the United Nations.
Well deserved.
We have a move of a United States Embassy is moving from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and it'll be happening in May. This is a good time to be an Israeli.
Yeah, it's great. I think...
And that was very convincing. I can go right now to my second question.
No, I think one of the things the Prime Minister focused on in his speech that is not understood is how much Israel's a rising power in the world and our international standing in the world. You know, there was a magazine came out last year with a ranking of the most powerful countries in the world, and Israel was ranked 8th. 8th. Now, it wasn't a ranking.
What's 9th?
From the local Hadassah chapter of Nashville. Okay? Not that I have anything against Hadassah. This is International Women's Day, and we put Hadassah and Henrietta Zold on the list of those who made the greatest contribution to Israel in the U.S.-Israel relationship. Every day I'm announcing one more honoree in that list. But what people don't understand is Israel's a very, very powerful country. We're a young country. We're the size of New Jersey, but we were ranked the 8th most powerful country in the world. So who are the powerful countries? Obviously, there's the United States. There's Russia. There's China. There's Britain. There's France, the so-called P5, permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. There was Germany and Japan. And then there was Israel. You asked who was 9th.
Yeah,
it was
9.
Iran, which is the bad side.
That must piss them off.
But
I mean, if anybody should not want to be 9 in this case.
But the reason why we're strong is we have a very strong military that's getting stronger with great assistance, frankly, by the United States of America, the F-35s, the missile development programs that we do together, Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow. We're also a rising economic power. I mean, Israel's a global technological power. It's hard for people to understand in agriculture and water, which are old industries, but also in cyber, in autonomous vehicles, and in many other areas. The cyber statistic is, I think, the one that's most remarkable because Israel's 0.1% of the world's population. That's it. And we account for 20% of private global investment in cybersecurity. So Israel's punching 200 times above its weight. So when you think of cyber, Israel's not a small country this size. In New Jersey with 8-9 million people, it's much bigger than a China. And people don't really understand that. And what has happened is because we are a rising military and intelligence, I should say, a very strong and superb intelligence a service that we have, because we're a rising military and economic power, it has also led to a flourishing of Israel's diplomatic relations around the world. And that's a story that is just now coming to the surface.
Now, is that because of cooperation, because of bilateral agreements? What is it? Everybody's saying we need your technology, or
Yeah.
they're saying
They want two
teach us
things.
how to do stuff?
Oh, that too. It's two things. They want us, Israel, to help keep their citizens safe because we have one of the finest intelligence services in the world. And the second thing is they want the technology. For some it's agriculture, for some it's water, for some it's cyber. It could be many things, but everyone is sort of looking at Israel as a great power. And look, there's two great centers of innovation in the world. The first is to the west of here, Silicon Valley. The other's to the east, what some people call Silicon Valley. We are a global technological
This
power.
is the term, the startup nation.
Yeah, and we have translated that military and economic power now into diplomatic power. You've just begun to see it. Now, it has not translated yet into votes in international institutions like the United Nations. Hasn't happened yet. Our bilateral ties with countries like India, those of you who recall there was a non-aligned movement. It was led by India and Egypt. Well, today, Israel's relations with Egypt are better than ever. Today, our relations with India are by orders of magnitude better than ever. Modi, the Prime Minister of India, made his first visit, the first visit of any Indian Prime Minister in Israel's history last year. And earlier this year, a couple of months ago, the Prime Minister paid a return visit to India. So you see the whole structure of global politics is beginning to change, and our bilateral ties are flourishing. What has not happened yet, as I said, is to translate that into support for Israel in multinational institutions. And what we needed, frankly, to have that happen is we needed a tailwind from Washington. And we got one, and her name is Hurricane Haley. And with obviously the support of the president, because it doesn't happen without the support of the president, you have seen a big pushback against efforts to demonize Israel, to delegitimize Israel at the United Nations. And so I actually believe that it will be possible in a few years, it won't happen overnight, to finally end the automatic majorities against Israel at the United Nations and other international institutions.
Now, speaking as a diplomat, as an ambassador, did the Israelis think that their high-tech achievements could end up becoming a kind of motivator to improve the diplomatic relations? Was this an unintended consequence?
No, it was a strategy of the Prime Minister from the beginning. For as long as I can remember, I've been with him in one capacity or another for 18 years, and he's a strong believer that countries ally with the strong, and that the key to Israel's diplomatic flourishing in the future is not, look, if we can get peace with the Palestinians, we should try to get peace with the Palestinians. It's a separate issue. But there were many people who thought, well, the key to opening up the world for Israel was to have peace with the Palestinians, which was not true historically, because the big change in Israel's international standing in terms of our relations with countries around the world actually came after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Right.
That's when we actually established diplomatic ties with many countries. But he understands that ultimately countries are going to ally and have relations with other countries that they need things from. And one of the things that he constantly told me, ever since I met him, is that, look, you cannot wait and hope that the other side is just going to make peace with you. You have to become stronger and stronger and stronger. And the stronger you are, the more you will bring peace closer. And that's what happened in Israel's 30 years as a state between 1948 and 1977. We did not have peace with anyone. We didn't just throw up our hands and say, oy vey. We built our country. And because we were a strong country, in this case really strong militarily, that they hit a sort of iron wall, our enemies, in trying to destroy us, ultimately there was a leader like Sadat who was willing to cross a psychological Rubicon and make peace, and as has been the case always and will remain the case. Second, you have an Arab leader who wants to make peace with Israel, who speaks peace to his own people. You will see Israelis make peace with that leader. And it took us 30 years to get peace with Egypt. It took us another 17 years to formalize a de facto peace with Jordan. And we would like to see that circle of peace expand. I think we are in a better position today vis-a-vis the wider Arab world than we have ever been. And I'm more optimistic than I have been certainly in 20 years about the prospect of a broader reconciliation between Israel and the Arab world, because we are so strong and because what we have is so wanted, both within the region and beyond.
This also fulfills another expectation, which was that Israel's technology would shift the conversation into something other than the conflict. I've known as someone who speaks around the country on behalf of Israel. We have Amir Sagi, who's the Deputy Consul General here today somewhere.
Hey,
it's
hard. I feel like a French fry at McDonald's, but
right.
Yes.
Whenever they've sent me out, I know that office has always said, you know, we shouldn't only be talking about the conflict. There's so much going on in our vibrant, robust country. Let's have the world talk about our technical achievements, our cyber achievements, our economy. There's so much more here than what everyone else wants to focus on. So let's go back to what everyone else...
And that, by the way, I should just say, that's true in a lot of the world. Meaning that's what they're focused on in China, that's what they're focused on in India.
I mean, they're not spending a lot of time talking about the conflict.
Not at all. I mean, and I can actually tell you, I was in the Prime Minister's office for 4 years, I could sort of close my eyes, listen to the conversation, and tell you who we were meeting with, depending on what % of the conversation was devoted to what topic.
So you're saying it's possible to be in a meeting with a foreign entity and the word Palestinian doesn't come up? Absolutely.
No, it's not possible. I've been in many meetings like that. And in fact, usually what happens, and it's sort of if you're in a meeting and let's say 50% or 60% is about your bilateral relationship and technology, and then there's another 20% about Iran and some of those threats, and another 10%. And then maybe what would happen is the Prime Minister would, right before the end of the meeting, would raise the Palestinian issue just to even bring it up in conversation. Wow. I would know I was in Delhi or in Beijing or in Tokyo, because they're interested in all those other things that Israel can do for them. When you go to Paris, you know, half your conversation will be about the Palestinians, about 20% on Iran, and about maybe 20% on the rest of the region, and 10% on bilateral ties. But in most of the world, in Latin America, in Africa,
bring us water.
Teach us
how to do water,
agriculture,
cyber.
All of those things, that's what they want to actually talk about. It's really in Western Europe.
Yeah.
I think that's when the conversation about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is strongest. And obviously with the United States, it's something we always discuss because the U.S. is the leader in that effort ultimately to help the parties achieve peace. But the rest of the world is really focused on what Israel can do for them.
So let's talk about the United States-Israeli relationship, alliance, because everyone's interested in that, and it's been a fascinating and strange year. It's fair to say that certainly towards the end of the Obama administration, there was a sort of chilly relationship with the Oval Office and Israel, culminating, of course, in UN Security Council Resolution 2334. Which, among other things, essentially blames the settlements as the failure of the peace process and insists that Israel goes back to its pre-armistice line. And as we know, the United States did not veto that resolution, and that created a tremendous amount of tension as the Obama administration was leaving. And of course, the Iran deal, nuclear deal. Now we have
small matter,
that thing, and we'll talk about some of that today. But here we have President Trump, who frankly most Jews didn't vote for. But in Israel, I mean, they're naming a train station for him. There's going to be a Trump train station somewhere, and I've even seen where it's going to look. It's in Jerusalem. I've seen it.
It'll get there under budget and on time.
Yeah, and he's going to love that. It'll have, like, on the front of the train, it'll have like a comb over or something. It'll have a really cool icon. It's interesting because of this change in this relationship. Can you give us the feeling of two things? The way Israelis feel about Trump, because they do have a lot of affection for him already, and maybe also talk to us about how important this recognition of Jerusalem as the capital, the official capital for the United States, and the decision so quickly to move the embassy. You know, people even in New York, this is a very popular decision, but the Israelis respond yet in a different way. Wow. So try to give us a sense of what this feels like in Israel.
Well, President Trump is extremely popular in Israel, but previous presidents were also very popular. I think Israel was just about the only place where both President Clinton and President Bush were hugely popular.
Right.
When Bush left office, he was extremely popular for many things that he did for Israel. The same thing with President Clinton. President Obama was different largely because almost out of the gate in his presidency, there was confrontation over certain issues, and it was never able to recover. But I think I saw a poll recently that asked Israelis, is the president pro-Israel, is he pro-Palestinian, or neither? And I think Trump's numbers were, I think it was even before the Jerusalem decision, if I'm not mistaken, 76% thought he was pro-Israel, 1% thought he was pro-Palestinian. So Israelis, I think, have a very positive attitude towards President Trump. Now, they don't follow all your domestic issues. They're not weighing in on those domestic
Stormy
issues.
Daniels means nothing to them.
And they're looking at the issues that affect them. And obviously, the biggest, and maybe we'll speak about that, security issue that affects us is Iran, and it's very clear he has a different position about this. But the Jerusalem decision was a historic decision. And it's something, by the way, that it is not a matter of political dispute within Israel. You had, the Arab parties, I would say, were different, and there were about 13 members. But of the 120 members of the Knesset, I think probably 105 celebrated that decision. And it was tough for Moses to get those kind of numbers. So it was very popular because it was a historic decision. I mean, I said the other day that the Jewish people remember Cyrus. I don't know if the Persians remember Cyrus, but the Jewish people remember Cyrus for a decision 2,500 years ago to allow the Jews to go back and to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. This is a historic decision that will echo. And so we're very grateful for President Trump for making that decision against the wishes of most of the entire international community, except for Israel. And there were even people within the administration who necessarily didn't support that decision, but he promised to do it, which many of his predecessors had done, but he actually did it. And they spoke to us about it before. What did we think was going to happen? Because there were some people who were making the argument it was going to lead to violence.
The Arab Street.
And we said, we don't see it. We don't think that's going to happen. And if it does, we'll bear the responsibility and shoulder the risk. Because if we're going to be scared every time somebody suggests that there's going to be violence, we never would have established a state or done anything. So it was important for us that he made this historic decision. And I think it goes with the great decisions. Certainly in the history of Zionism, there's been 4 in my mind. There was Balfour 100 years ago. There was the UN decision of partition 70 years ago. There was Truman's decision to recognize Israel. And now there's President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem and now to move the embassy. So it's something that I think unites the people of Israel that we're deeply grateful for. And you see also in your 14 months into the administration, you see the support at the United Nations that is unwavering. And then you see also a big shift in policy towards Iran. And 95% of Israel's security challenges really come from Iran.
I'm not asking you to play the role of a White House West Wing insider, but we do know that you have very shrewd, astute political skills. You worked in that capacity with Netanyahu for a number of years. Because on CNN all we hear about is the Mueller investigation and Stormy Daniels, why did Trump do this? Why do you think he did this?
You mean the Jerusalem decision?
Yeah, every president said, the Stormy Daniels thing. You're from Miami Beach, you know these things. Why? I mean, every president campaigned that he would move the embassy. Everyone got huge applause. And then, of course, they just had those every 6-month, delays. Why do you suspect?
I think he was ready to do it actually day one. There was more than a feeling, but there was a suggestion that he might do it as the first act of his presidency.
Right.
And he didn't do it then. So I guess a more interesting question is why did he do it 11 months before? And there was a trigger for his decision, and that was every 6 months, a president has to decide on a waiver. And in May, when that first came up, or the end of May, the beginning of June, he decided to waive it one more time. And then when the waiver came up in December, he said, no, I'm going to make this decision. And he also said that he believes it advances peace. And this is something that I don't think a lot of people understand. I completely agree with that. I do think it advances peace. It depends what you believe the reason is why we don't have peace.
He keeps saying it's off the table.
No. First of all, the decision that he made, if you actually listen very carefully to his speech, he actually doesn't take a position on final status issues.
At all.
He doesn't. Look, the Palestinians have a position that they've stated publicly many times that there should be 2 capitals. Jerusalem should be their capital and should be 2 capitals. And we have a position that Jerusalem should remain united under Israel's sovereignty. There is a common ground in that position, is that Jerusalem, under any circumstances, will be the capital of the state of Israel. So, in fact, President Trump did not prejudge final negotiations on anything, and he was very clear about that. I haven't predetermined any outcome, and unfortunately, the way that the Palestinians reacted was very different, and they used that excuse to run away from the negotiating table, and we know that. But the reason why I think it advances peace is you have to understand why we don't have peace. If you think the reason why Israel doesn't have peace is we haven't found the magic formula for this or that final status issue, then I suppose you could think that this decision sets back the cause of peace. But that's not why we don't have peace. We don't have peace because of the refusal of the Palestinians to recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state in any boundary. The Palestinian narrative is a very simple one. They believe we stole their house. That's what they teach their kids. So you could give 99.9% of a stolen house back, and they're not going to take it. And by 99%, I don't mean of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. I mean 99% of the whole house, you could give it back. If they think you stole their house, you'll never be able to achieve peace. They understand, some of them, that we're there by might, our might. But they don't understand that we're there by right, and they don't accept that we're there by right. And that is why there is a constant effort to delegitimize Israel, not just in international forums, but in a very, very private way on big issues that sometimes some people sort of dismiss. I'll give you an example. Arafat said to President Clinton at Camp David, there was never a temple on the Temple Mount. And Abu Mazen has a very difficult time, if you notice, when he speaks at the United Nations, to recognize a historical connection between the Jewish people and Jerusalem.
He just disavowed it last month.
He can't say it. Now, the question is why? And no one asks these questions, because, those are ideological issues. Forget about that. Let's focus on, what your position is on two states and what your position is on Jerusalem and what. Those are the issues, the ideological issues. The reason why they do that is to recognize a historical connection between the Jewish people and our historic homeland. To recognize a connection between the Jewish people and to Jerusalem is to admit that the Jewish people are not foreign colonialists in this land. Israel is not to us what India is to the British, or what Algeria was to the French, or what Congo was to the Belgians. This is our historic homeland. It's where our patriarchs prayed, and our prophets preached, and our kings ruled. And they understand that to recognize that, the whole edifice of this rejectionism collapses. So this is why the president's decision, from a historical perspective, you won't see it in a few weeks and maybe not in a few months, but in a historical perspective is so important because he punctures this great lie, this rejectionism that is greatest on the issue of Jerusalem and most obscene. He punctures it. And I think that lays a cornerstone for ultimately achieving peace, because only when they cross this Rubicon, only when the Palestinians say that the Jewish people are here by right. Now, they can say that they have rights. That's fine. Then you're in a discussion. I mean, even if the Palestinians said it's 1% yours,
right,
and 99% mine, then you're in a negotiation. But they don't say that. They say we stole their house. And President Trump's decision was the first decision in 70 years where a leader said, they did not steal your house. This house is where, this capital, is where the Jewish people were for 3,000 years in terms of their dreams and their longing, but in what was the capital of the Jewish state for 70. So it was a very important historical decision, and I hope it will advance the cause of peace.
And something similar is being advanced in the United Nations by Ambassador Haley's decision to withdraw from UNESCO, because UNESCO takes the same position, right? UNESCO,
you mean with UNRWA, I think UNESCO was withdrawn before the U.S.
Right, but both UNRWA, funding for UNRWA and UNESCO, because both they have the same thing in common, which is to disassociate and disclaim any connection between Jewish history, Jewish historical connection.
Yeah, they attack, and whether it's Hebron, I know the spokesman for the community of Hebron.
Yeshai Fleischer, my friend.
All right, they don't want to recognize a connection.
But I'm saying
so they'll say that the Cave of the Patriarchs is a Palestinian heritage site. And so you say, well, these things are just ridiculous historically. They are. But people don't understand how important it is to address these issues in order to actually advance ultimately a political settlement. because they're incapable of understanding. When you teach, and it's not just that the leadership sees this is what they teach their kids. This is what they teach them in the schools. This is what they see in the media all the time. And only when they start hearing a different story do you have hope of some leadership emerging in the future that is prepared to cross that Rubicon. And that's why other leaders around the world should follow President Trump. The president of Guatemala announced a couple days ago that he's going to move its embassy to Jerusalem. Everyone who does that, every country that does that, will actually lay another cornerstone in building an eventual peace.
I have a couple pieces to supplement. You know, I just love this when we talk to audiences. Not everybody knows this, but you know, what's the trivia question is, how many times is Jerusalem mentioned in the Old Testament? I think it's nearly 700, right? To demonstrate this connection between the Jews and their historic connection to Israel. How many times is Jerusalem mentioned in the Quran? Not once. I'm just sorry. Just says, it seems if it was that important, you would have mentioned it. So
what's also important is that we respect everyone's right to worship freely. We are the guarantors of freedom of worship for the three great monotheistic faiths. And we're the only ones in the history of Jerusalem that protected the rights of others. You see what's happening in the Middle East. You see where Christian communities are being decimated. Christians in places are decapitated in mass. 100 years ago, Christians accounted for 20% of the Middle East. Today, they're 4% and dropping. You see mosques that are blown up because you have a religious war that pits Sunni fanatics against Shia fanatics, and they both, the ones who are the greatest victims, and this is also important for us to always remember, the greatest victims of this fanaticism, it's not Jews, it's not Christians in terms of numbers, it's Muslims. Muslims who do not accept their fanatic creed. So you're blowing up mosques. These people are blowing up mosques around the Middle East, they're blowing up churches. Most of the Jewish synagogues were destroyed a long time ago. And Israel stands out as this country that is you know, the vanguard and the guarantor of freedom in a very, very dangerous part of the world. That's also why it's very important to keep these holy sites that can turn into a tinderbox very quickly under the control of the Israeli government that has frankly earned it in the way that we have conducted ourselves over the last 50 years since we reunited the city.
Let me clarify something the ambassador said a moment ago, too, this every 6-month extension. It's fascinating. People don't realize or remember that the United States Congress already voted to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, but they created this provision that the actual movement needed to be approved by the president, and it was on a 6-month. So think about this. From the mid-1990s, whoever was in the office, every 6 months went through a kind of charade, since the United States knew that the Congress had already made this decision, and Israel certainly was functioning, this was their capital, but they were extending it every 6 months.
What people don't realize is Jerusalem was our capital from 1949.
That's right, it's not new.
So everyone said, well, what about the peace process? Well, what happened between 1949 and 1995?
We were always there.
46 years. Right. Why wasn't the capital moved then? And it actually should have been moved during the Eisenhower administration, but that administration decided that it would be a smart policy to try to appease Nasser.
Right.
And that was the reason why they didn't do it. That didn't work out too well. And then it was oil, and then it was something. There was always another excuse. It reminded me, whenever the 6-month came up, I thought of that joke of the guy who rides into the town on his horse, and he's looking for a place to tie it up. He's looking, can't find anything. He sees this old Jewish guy on the side in this rocking chair. He says, why don't you go speak to the rabbi? So the guy on the horse says, well, why should I speak to the rabbi? He says, well, because he can tie anything to the Parshat HaShavua. You know, so there was always another reason why it wasn't moved.
Right.
No one had the courage and the guts to do it. And we're very, very thankful that President Trump had the guts to do it. And it's the right decision. And it also is a decision that ultimately will advance peace.
Let me ask you something you said before that always fascinates me. I asked a similar question once when I was in the Israeli foreign ministry, and I asked a deputy minister, you know, they'll say what you said. You know, we have meetings with diplomats, and we have very different kinds of conversations with them. And we're friendly, and they know our value, and they respect us. And then they go into the UN, and they vote against us and condemn us as the most evil empire ever. Or they go to the streets and condemn us and say we're monkeys and pigs. You're a diplomat. Your job is to be diplomatic. how do you, I mean, do you ever speak to these guys and say, cut it out? You know, we're friends.
I've not been accused of being overly diplomatic, I have to say.
How could you say that in public when you know it's not true, and you know we have relationships with you, and you're just tarring us and playing to the Arab street or playing to whatever liberal, progressive...
I thought you were talking about Europeans. You're talking about Arabs.
I'm talking about Arabs and Europeans. I'm saying in both instances, the Egyptians now are great allies. The Saudis have become allies. But it's not clear what would happen if Israel was accused of having, you know, just landed on the Mars, and they would have condemned you for doing that. They would
let's you know, put the European issue aside, because that's very complicated of why they have, especially in Western Europe, why they have their views of Israel and their attitudes towards Israel, because in many ways Israel's become a protector of Europe. Almost as a sort of forward position, because if it were not for Israel, what you saw happen in Syria would happen in other places in North Africa. And if you thought there was a refugee crisis and security crisis, it would be much worse. Israel's holding a good part of the Middle East together because of our military power, intelligence power. And I didn't mention this before, but Israel's intelligence agencies has prevented dozens of major terrorist attacks around the world, and we give that intelligence to European governments and other governments. It was just released publicly, so I can say it, that we provided, you know, intelligence that prevented the downing of a plane going from Australia to the Gulf that would have killed hundreds of people and also had a dramatic impact, obviously, on international air travel. But with the case of the Arab states, there is definitely something new. Arab governments, I wouldn't say Arab peoples yet, but it's moving in that direction. Arab governments have changed their attitude towards Israel. And that's a result of, I think, three factors coming together. The first was the empowering of Iran. And they're frightened to death, and they should be, of Iran. Because for Iran, you know, Riyadh is breakfast and Jerusalem is dinner. Jerusalem is lunch. New York, actually, is dinner. But they're afraid because they're breakfast. And most of those Arab states in the Gulf are afraid of Iran, the empowerment of Iran. They're also afraid of the Sunni fanaticism. Now, Sunni fanaticism 1.0 was Al-Qaeda, 2.0 was ISIS, but there'll be a 3.0 and a 4.0. So you see these two twin fanaticisms, this Iranian tiger and this radical sort of leopard on the Sunni side of the equation. And then what they saw is the United States basically withdrew from the region. That was their perception, whether that was intended or not. So the 800-pound American guerrillas sort of left the building when you have these lion, tiger and leopard. And then they look, and they see in the corner a 250-pound gorilla with a keep on their head. And they said, well, you know, maybe we should work with them in fighting a common enemy. The problem for these governments is that they have poisoned their populations for 70 years against Israel. It is very hard for them to turn on a dime. Now, they're not democracies, but public opinion, even in non-democratic societies, does matter, does have an impact, and it's very hard for them to surface. I think if they could do it and snap their fingers, they would do it. And they'd like to see this conflict end between Israelis and Palestinians. They would. It was not true in the past.
So you're saying they don't feel there's an advantage to them anymore?
No, they used to. They used to feel that it helped them divert from the problem, their own internal problems, and the fact that many of these societies, you know, I'll be generous, are in the 19th century, but that's being very generous. So they diverted a lot of attention with their own problems of governance and the failure to enable their populations to enter the modern world. That's the story of the past. Right now, what they see is an Israel that can both help defend them against the common enemy, but also help them seize the future because of Israel's technological prowess. Many people don't understand this, but imagine you'd have a situation where, you know, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, Oregon was all decided to boycott Silicon Valley. That's what happens in the Middle East. They've got a center of innovation right next door. And I believe some young leaders in the Arab world actually understand this. So it's not just the security, it's also the technology. And those two things together are creating, I think, a unique opportunity to advance peace, something that did not exist It's not a new idea, getting the Arabs in the region to contribute to a peace process, but the moment was not right to do that. Now that moment is there. How you surface it is something that is very complicated and difficult because of this 70 years of poisoning. But it's something that the team that's working, Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt and David Friedman, the team and the other people in the administration that are working on an eventual peace initiative, it's something new that their predecessors actually did not have. And you can have a very good relationship with the Arab states in the region and with Israel. And that's what this administration is showing once again.
Well, let's talk about this peace process, since there is some thought there is an ultimate deal in the works. It was just recently reported that Abbas is ill and might at some point resign. His successor is unknown. We know a month ago, again, at the UN Security Council, he repeated anti-Semitic tropes. He once again disassociated Jews with their historic connection to Jerusalem. You have Gaza is a deteriorating economic mess, and Hamas can't even really put the lights on anymore.
I was trying to be optimistic.
Yeah, I know. No, I want to know. I know, but I want to know. So, who do we have a peace partner? It may be true that Saudi Arabia and Egypt now have very different connections to Israel. But I mean, the Israeli right has always been suspicious. They've always been skeptical when they would say the question, make peace with who?
And rightfully so, because, Israelis also, they're not big fans of baseball, but somehow the concept of 3 strikes and you're out translated into Hebrew, because, we left southern Lebanon and we got a lot of promises of a better situation. We ended up with an Iranian terror base on our northern border. We unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, and we did exactly what the international community says. Leave to the 67 line, uproot all the settlements. We did everything. We actually disinterred people from their graves. And it was supposed to be, some people said, the Singapore of the Middle East. And what happened was another terror base where thousands of rockets were fired. And so Israelis understand that if all of a sudden Israel just gets up and leaves, separate from the issue of who has the right to the territory, if Israel just leaves from a basic security point of view, you're going to repeat this mistake for a third time. So I think they get that. Look, as to the question, I think having an Arab governments, and it's beginning to happen in the Arab world. There's some public opinion, interesting thing. It's internet polling, so it's not entirely accurate. And how do you actually poll in societies that are not democratic? Right. With all those caveats and all those problems, we are seeing trends of more and more acceptance among the younger Arab populations, and they're very, very young, which some people think can be very dangerous. It also affords tremendous opportunities because you have a switch. It could happen much faster than people think.
You mean younger than college age?
Yeah, about 2/3 of these populations in many of these countries are under the age of 35. So it's you can have a huge shift in a fairly short amount of time, but there's a willingness to work with Israel and to have relations with Israel. The issue for the Palestinians has always been, and I don't believe personally it depends on this or that leader. I think to believe that is to not understand the problem. The best metric to understand if we're getting closer to peace or not is not to look at what the latest speech was of the Palestinian leader, to listen to what the latest thing said by this or that envoy, or who the president is, or who the Secretary of State, with utmost respect to everybody. It's look at what Palestinian children are learning in the schools and look what they're watching on television. That's how you know if you're moving closer to peace or further away from peace. Peace will come when you have a Palestinian leadership that cares about the Palestinians more than they care about the Palestinian cause. I do think there was one leader, I don't know if it will help him if I say it, but I think Fayyad was the one Palestinian leader who, in my view, in a century, actually cared about improving Palestinian lives. Now, a Palestinian leader who wants to improve Palestinian lives, they're going to want to seek peace with Israel because it will improve Palestinian lives. But understand the Palestinian cause ends when there's peace with Israel, because the cause, unfortunately, for the last 100 years has not been to establish a Palestinian state, it's been to destroy a Jewish state. That's why the PLO was established in 1964, when they had control of all those territories that they claim to want for a Palestinian state. That's the moderate faction, not Hamas, that says they want to destroy all of Israel. So the problem is you have Palestinian leaders committed to this cause, which has been the destruction of Israel. That's what the cause has been and remains. And they poison the next generation. And they also pay terrorists to murder Jews. You see, this is finally coming to the surface. There's a Taylor Force Act that's working its way through Congress. Palestinians provide about 10% of their budget, about $400 million, to pay terrorists and their families.
It's worse than that. It's tuition benefits, life insurance, death benefits. It's $400 million a year.
Morbid meaning from cradle to grave.
Yeah.
It gives a morbid meaning for it. But
Incentivizing
this
death.
is a real problem, and no one paid attention to this. Everyone's just saying, okay, what's those 4 final status issues? How can we work out exactly the right formula? Let's get them into a room and we'll get... No. You got to deal with the ideological core of the conflict. Understand, when that decision was put forward by the UN in 1947, a Jewish state and an Arab state, that's what the UN decision was. There were no refugees. There were none of these post-67 settlements.
There were no Jews in the West Bank.
Well, there were actually in certain places like in Gush Etzion and others, yeah. But when Jews get thrown out of everywhere, everybody forgets it. But yeah, there were some Jewish communities there. But all of these issues that are seen as final status issues, none of those issues were there. There was just a question: would you accept a Jewish state and an Arab state? 2 states for 2 peoples, and they rejected it. And if you don't go to the core of that rejection and address it and tell them, yes, the Jewish people have a claim to this land by right, and you must accept it. If you don't do that, you will never be able to actually have a genuine peace. You can have a peace based on deterrence, which is essentially just new lines, armistice lines. Mm-hmm. But because Israel is so small, that becomes almost impossible to do. To protect yourself when you have a Palestinian leadership that's not devoted to a state that will live alongside of Israel, but want a state instead of Israel, or a state not to end the conflict, but to continue the conflict.
George Bush, or was it Lyndon Johnson, who said the thin neck, we have parking lots in Texas wider than this?
Yeah, driveways. That came because
This is how thin the border would be between...
yeah, you didn't do justice to his Texas drawl.
You have to do it with the drawl. Can you do it with the drawl?
Sharon, I don't know, I'm going to try. You have...
It's in the helicopter.
Yeah, I have the helicopter. Ariel Sharon is then foreign minister in Netanyahu's first government, and he takes then Governor Bush up in a helicopter, and he's looking around. And when you go up, you don't have to go up that high in Israel in a helicopter. You see the Mediterranean on one side, you see the Jordan on the other, and he said, you know, Mr. Minister, there are driveways in Texas that are longer than this country is wide. Yes, that's what he said. People understand that Israel's security problem is so acute because the country is simply so small. I know everybody, and it's also a very dangerous neighborhood. I know that people think the key to peace is mutually agreed land swaps. Yeah. I say mutually agreed neighbor swaps, right? So I understand you have issues with Mexico. So we'll swap Syria for Mexico. What do you guys say? All right? And then we'll take Canada. You can take anybody you want from the rest. But we're in a very, very dangerous neighborhood. We're a powerful country, but we're a very small country. And if we do not make the right decisions, we can go from great strength to great vulnerability like that. That's the danger. And you'll win a couple of good editorials in newspapers in New York and elsewhere. But as Golda Meir famously said, what? You remember what she said?
Loving their children as much as...
Yeah, well, she said that too. But she said, you know, better bad press than a good eulogy.
Eulogy, right. So speaking about dangerous neighborhood, Iran, they've become much more promiscuous now in the region. Just recently they launched a drone into Israel. Israel shot it down. They flew into Syria, knocked out some aerial defense batteries, destroyed some military installations, but they're in Syria. Syria is either at the end of its civil war or not, but we have no idea what's going to happen after. There's ongoing support of Hezbollah. You now have a new president who wants to take a tougher position on Iran. What is it that you hope President Trump will do? Modify the agreement, decertify the agreement, insist on military inspections, take away the sunset provisions, snapback provisions, all these things. What's the most effective thing to do now that we already have this agreement in place?
Well, look, there's been bad agreements in history, and you can't just say when you know an agreement is bad and not working that everyone says, well, we have an agreement and so we should just continue and we should just walk off the cliff. Understand what the problem with the deal is. This deal, nuclear deal with Iran, puts us on cruise control heading over a cliff. That's what the deal is, and I'll explain why. What the deal says is that the restrictions that were put in place on Iran's nuclear program, those restrictions are automatically removed at a date certain. At first, when the deal was signed, it was 10 to 15 years. Now that's 8 to 13 years. But they're going to be automatically removed. It doesn't matter if Iran continues to be the foremost sponsor of terrorism in the world. It doesn't matter if Iran remains committed to Israel's destruction. It doesn't matter how Iran behaves. What matters is that the calendar has to change. And Iran then will not need to sneak in or break into the nuclear club. They will simply walk into the nuclear club, because when those restrictions are removed, Iran will legitimately be able to enrich massive amounts of uranium. So they will not just go into one bomb, they could have an entire nuclear arsenal. So we are on cruise control heading over a cliff. And when people say, hey, the deal is working, well, to say the deal is working is to say the cruise control is working. What about the cliff? And the job of a prime minister of Israel is to think about that cliff and avoiding that cliff. But it will happen if the trajectory is not changed. And the major flaw in the deal is what you said, called the sunset clause, which is the automatic removal of all these restrictions. You remember the prime minister made a speech in Congress 3 years ago. If you go back and reread the speech, you will see very clearly what he says the major flaw is. He said you must link the removal of these restrictions to a change in Iran's behavior. Treat Iran as a normal country when it starts acting like a normal country. But that's not what has happened. And you have this inspection regime, which is a joke. It's a joke. It's looking for the proverbial keys underneath the lamppost. The Iranian regime says we're not going to allow for the inspection of military sites. They did a self-inspection, those of you who really follow this closely, about 3 years ago, which is another joke. It was a joke. And we have to change the trajectory. Europe is in a position of containment, meaning they are trying to contain a nuclear Iran. We'll have to live with it the best we can. What President Trump did in October is he shifted the U.S. position from one of containing a nuclear Iran to preventing a nuclear Iran. And that's the position of Israel, and there must be a radical change in the deal, that it must be fully fixed, all the problems of the deal taken out, or it has to be nixed. He's got to walk away from the deal and restore sanctions and take the actions that are necessary to make sure that Iran never has a nuclear weapon, not today, not tomorrow, not in 5 years, 10 years, or ever. The other problem is that in exchange for Iran accepting the temporary restrictions on its program, which are temporary, as I said, you had the removal of the sanctions. And Iran had huge money coming into its coffers, huge money. When Iran was under sanctions, they were selling about 1 million barrels of oil a day. Now they're over 2.5 million. So that's 1.5 million more barrels a day at a price of $63 or $64. That's about $100 million a day. That's $3 billion a month, $36 billion a year at the current price of oil. Now, I'd love to tell you that Iran's going to use that money and start a GI Bill for returning members of the Revolutionary Guard. But that's not what they're doing. What they're doing is using it to fund their war machine. And they are literally conquering the Middle East. They're taking over Iraq, trying to take over Syria. They've already taken over Lebanon through Hezbollah, and they're trying to do it in Yemen. And to create for the Saudis, from the south of Saudi Arabia, what they created to the north of Israel in Lebanon. Through the Houthis, their terror proxy in Yemen, they're arming them, trying to arm them with missiles to endanger Saudi Arabia. So Iran is trying to conquer the Middle East. And all that money, now they're flush with cash, and it's very, very dangerous for the region. So if President Trump cannot get the other members, permanent members, to have a huge shift in their policy, and I don't see a sign now that they're prepared to have such a shift, then he needs to walk away. He needs to restore those sanctions. Israel will certainly support it. The Arab states in the region will certainly support it.
So who wouldn't support it? Western Europeans?
Well, we'll see. We'll see what will happen. I mean, when Western European banks and businesses have to choose between doing business with a 20 trillion United States economy or 400 billion Iranian economy, I think they're going to choose to do business with the United States. So you can create enormous pressures on Iran. And Iran is a hollow, I mean, it's a would-be empire, and certainly an evil one at that, but it's a hollow country. It's very weak from the inside. Its people do not support it. You saw that in the streets a couple months ago. Remember with the Soviet Union, how everyone thought it was so dangerous and that pressure would only help the extremists and everything else. The reverse happened. And I remember when President Trump made his decision in October and took a very hard line, and just the fact that he threatened to walk away has frozen investments from going into Iran now because people are not sure. Why should we invest? We don't know what the policy is going to be. That very fact, a lot of people at the time when he said that, now you're going to actually empower the hardliners. Nonsense. It empowered the people in Iran that understood that there is not going to be an economic light at the end of the tunnel, and they took to the streets. And many were complaining about the funding of the war machine in Syria and in Lebanon, and all their money not going to the people of Iran, but funding this fanatic Shia ideology, which is what they're committed to. The final point I want to make about this, there may be people here who believe that, well, at least now we've sort of kicked this can down the road for 10 years.
Which is what the Obama administration said.
That is not true. Because right now, as we speak, Iran's advancing its nuclear weapons program, as we speak. Because they are doing R&D on advanced centrifuges, which they are allowed to do under the deal. That's what spins and enriches the uranium. My favorite line from this 160-page deal was a line that says, over the next decade, Iran can only do R&D on the IR-2, 4, 6, and 8. The IR-2, 4, 6, and 8 are more and more advanced centrifuges over the next decade. That's like saying that Apple can only do R&D over the next few years on the iPhone 11, 12, 13, and 14. So under this deal, Iran is illegally doing R&D on advanced centrifuges, and they are developing ballistic missiles that have range, further and further range. And those missiles, they're not for us. They can already hit Israel. Those missiles are for you. And only in cartoons do you put TNT on intercontinental ballistic missiles. In the real world, you put a nuclear warhead. And this is happening. Everyone is going through the motions internationally, and everyone's saying, well, no, you shouldn't do that. They are developing intercontinental ballistic missiles to reach all of Europe and ultimately the United States. And now you have in North Korea a single, and maybe there'll be interesting news today there, but you have in North Korea one regime, which is essentially a family business, and half of Asia quakes. Right. Now imagine that you have a fanaticism with this revolutionary ideology, which has intercontinental ballistic missiles and 100 nuclear weapons. That's the world that we're walking into unless we change the trajectory. And one final point I want to make about that, because I mentioned North Korea. You remember there were negotiations with North Korea. It was the six-party talks. There was a moral difference between the six-party talks with North Korea and the P5+1 talks on the Iran deal. In those six-party talks with North Korea, your two allies were there at those talks. The Japanese were there, and the South Koreans were there. And it's very hard to blame either President Clinton or President Bush, both of whom did deals, when your allies in the region, the ones that have the most to lose or to gain, the most skin in the game, when they're telling you to do the deal. In the case of the P5+1 talks, Israel was not there. The Arab states were not there. Somebody told me once, if you're not sitting around the negotiating table, you're probably on the menu. And we are the guinea pigs in this experiment. So with all due respect to the French, to the Germans, and to the British, this is our lives. It's the lives of our children. It's ultimately theirs too. They just don't know it yet. But we're the first line of defense. And when the Arabs and Israelis are telling you that this thing is a disaster, and it's empowered Iran to run and try to conquer the entire Middle East, and they're on a glide path to nuclear weapons, and now the Saudis are saying, wait a second, if you allow Iran to do enrichment. We want to do enrichment too. And there's a logic to their position. And we said at the time, Netanyahu said in his speech to Congress, this is not a farewell to arms. This is a farewell to arms control. This will nuclearize the entire Middle East. And because people don't see the bomb explode today, they're simply walking closer and closer to this danger. And I have tremendous respect for President Trump for taking this stand now. Because he could have come in and said, it's not going to happen on my watch. It's somebody else's problem.
Kicking the can again.
He could have kicked the can down the road, but then it would have been a nuclear can. And the whole world would have paid the price. And he says now, I wish they would have dealt with this problem in North Korea 10 or 15 years ago. Well, now he's doing that now, in dealing with this thing now. And I think it's somebody, no matter what you think of President Trump's policies on all sorts of issues, on this issue, to the extent that you are concerned with the security and survival of Israel, President Trump should, and I think must be supported.
I suspect you would say that it's precisely because Israel did not have a seat at this negotiating table that Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech before Congress was so important.
It was his highest obligation, well, not highest, second highest. Highest obligation is that you have to take action to defend your country. But your second highest is that you have to speak up in time. And I know it was a matter of controversy to many people. I never saw it as being controversial at all, because a prime minister has an obligation to speak up on a matter of national survival.
And I guess you were involved in those discussions to bring him to?
Absolutely, and it was the proudest moment that I had as ambassador of Israel, and I would do it again in a heartbeat, because that is our responsibility. You know, Israel has given the Jewish people, in my view, three priceless gifts. One is, the most important one is the power to defend ourselves. You know, we haven't gotten rid of anti-Semitism and hatred, but the birth of Israel gave the Jewish people the ability to defend themselves against that hatred. The second is we have a refuge. You know, for most centuries, what Jewish communities were interested in and focused on is, where are we going to go when inevitably something happens and we're forced to flee? There's a lot of problems that people see around the world with Jewish communities, the rise of anti-Semitism and other concerns that people have. But one question they stopped asking is, where are these Jews going to go? Because there's an Israel. Doesn't mean that all of them have to go to Israel. They should be protected by their own governments, but everybody has the right to go to Israel, and that's a blessing that the birth and the establishment of a Jewish state gave the Jewish people. But the third one, which is very, very important, is that the Jewish people have a voice. You know, one of the things during the time, the worst days of the Holocaust, is we had to beg, you know, Polish diplomats to go and to speak to somebody in Washington and tell them what's happening. And it's hard for people to understand that this disc has sort of changed. You know, I get people all the time who come up to me and said, well, I know a guy who knows the senator, so maybe I'll get you together, and maybe you can speak to him. And I say to them, look, if I want to speak to the senator, I pick up a phone. It's not because of me personally. It's because I have the privilege of representing Israel as its ambassador. And they don't really understand what it means to be a sovereign state. And when that decision was being made, and the Prime Minister accepted this invitation to come and speak, to me it was a no-brainer. And the best way that I could explain it was I thought of what happened with the Evian Conference in 1938. Those of you who know history here, the Evian Conference was a conference that Roosevelt was essentially pressured into establishing to deal with the Jewish refugee problem in Europe. And most of the countries of the world, a lot of them came to Evian, and there's a very famous letter that Hitler sent to the delegates of the Evian Conference. He said, you can have the Jews, I'll even put them on luxury ships. That's a quote. I'll even put them on luxury ships. And no one took the Jews, to the best of my recollection, with two exceptions. The Kinder transport, where 10,000 children were saved by the British, and the Dominican Republic took a huge number of Jews, I think around 100,000. What was interesting to me in reading the history of that conference is there was a delegate to that conference from then mandatory Palestine and they were allowed to go there, they just weren't allowed to speak. The name of that delegate was Golda Meir. And I thought to myself, on the eve of the destruction of European Jewry, the future Prime Minister of Israel was not allowed to speak. Faced with a regime that calls for the destruction of the one and only Jewish state, this Prime Minister of Israel will speak. And he spoke.
All right, let's take a question from the audience, and then we'll say goodnight to our ambassador. This is a tough one, and I'm only giving it to you.
So skip it.
Yeah, because the other ones are tougher. I had to pick the one that is the least tough. And this is interesting because you now are an Israeli citizen, but for most of your life you were an American citizen, and you grew up in Miami Beach. We all know that now. So you know this country. So how do you reconcile President Trump's support of Israel with the rise of neo-Nazism and anti-Semitism during his presidency? And so they're describing Charlottesville and some of the other incidents that we've seen, a kind of normalization of old school right-wing, not the university left-wing progressive anti-Semitism that I see every day, but the other kind, the kind that we thought after the Holocaust had went away and we would never see again, and we didn't realize how dormant it could be and could be rising. And when I ask this question, I'd like to add on to this to say, I know Prime Minister Netanyahu took a very strong position about the Polish Holocaust law. Remember, in Poland now, they too have a very right-wing, ultranationalist government in power, and they just passed through their Senate and their Congress and was signed by the President of Poland a new law that makes it a crime to associate Poles with any complicity or collusion with the Holocaust. So, for instance, as a child of Holocaust survivors, I should be very careful if I go back to Warsaw. I should not say that my parents, their neighbors who were Poles, may have had ratted them out, so to speak. So we're seeing ultranationalism everywhere, not just here. Israel is in a very powerful position, but I think this person wants to know, but there's still the rise of Nazism.
Yeah, there is. And as I said before, the thing that Israel, I mean, there were Zionists. It's debatable whether Herzl was one of them, but there were many who believed that the birth of the Jewish state would actually end anti-Semitism. They thought that the reason why there was anti-Semitism is that the Jews did not have a state. And if we could establish a state, we would be treated like minorities. If we were outside of that state, minorities everywhere. They said, look, we have a problem. We're minorities everywhere, but we don't have that one state where we're a majority. We would normalize the condition of the Jews and end anti-Semitism if we could establish Israel. What's interesting is that it's come completely full circle. So a century ago, they said the reason why there's anti-Semitism is that the Jews do not have a state. Now people say the reason why there's anti-Semitism is because the Jews do have a state. 100 years ago, they say Jews go to Palestine. Now, 100 years later, they say Jews get out of Palestine.
But you have no connection to Palestine.
Israel is not the cause or the cure, right, for anti-Semitism. But Israel gave the Jewish people power. That's what happened with the birth of Israel. And it gave us the power to fight back against anti-Semitism. And it means fighting back on the battlefield, but it also means fighting back on the battlefield in the courts of public opinion, where you have to confront it. And you can have anti-Semitism on the right, and you can have anti-Semitism on the left. And I think the reemergence of some of these movements is less about anti-Semitism per se, but the fraying of sort of the center of politics, and it's happening all around the world. And we have to be very vigilant about it, and we have to speak out about it. It's a responsibility of leaders of governments to do so. And I just think we're going to have to do it. But if you think about the situation that we're in today, compared to the time when we were defenseless against these enemies, it's a dramatic change. And one thing I tell people about being Israel's ambassador, the most remarkable thing is that there are ambassadors of Israel, that we do have this voice, or that we do have a state. Because as difficult and challenging as the situation is, we Jews have a unique capacity of seeing the glass as 1/16 empty. We're very good at that. But if you think about it, your grandparents and their grandparents and their grandparents, going back 100 generations, would have given anything to trade their problems with ours. We are a uniquely blessed generation to live at a time when there is a sovereign Jewish state. There's 100 generations dreamed of having the privilege that 3 generations have had. And with that privilege, in my view, comes a awesome responsibility, and that is to secure that dream for generations to come. And my view is that responsibility does not fall on the shoulders of prime ministers or ambassadors alone. It falls on the shoulders of all of us, of people who get engaged and come to listen to 2 old Miami Beach bums talk at the 92nd Street Y. We have to remain engaged. We've got one Jewish state. It's a priceless gift that we have inherited, and we have to do everything we can to strengthen it and to nurture it and to cultivate it and to secure it for future generations.
I think if you didn't know already, and everyone in this room probably already did because you follow Israel and its politics, but I think we all know that Israel is so ably represented in the United States by Ambassador Ron Dermer.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask you, thank you. I'm going to have the ambassador leave, and I'm going to ask you to hold your seats for security purposes. And so we're going to say goodbye.
I thought they were a nice audience. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so please sit in your seats just for a second while security takes the ambassador out. We have a lot of programs for folks.org, folcs.org. Please go on our website. Of course, the 92Ys website. We're here all the time. We're so happy that you came out one day after the snow. Good night. Thank you again.